If you're looking for a quick and easy place to store and persist the data for your application, look no further than Airtable. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a base where you can store your data and then how to perform CRUD operations through raw HTTP requests, as well as using the Airtable package from NPM in JavaScript to make that process even a little bit easier. That's what we're going to do, so let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, so in this video, we're going to take a look at creating a base in Airtable and then two different ways to perform CRUD operations. One is just with raw HTTP requests. So sending those through Postman is what we're going to use. You could use another tool like Insomnia or something like that. And then also we're going to look at the Airtable package on NPM, and it's basically just a wrapper around that API to make it a little bit easier to work with inside of your application. So before we get started, I do want to share that if you enjoy Airtable and this video, I'm working on a course called React and Serverless Full Stack Development that is releasing on May 27th, which will include using Airtable as a high scores table for our typing game. So if you're interested in how to incorporate Airtable into serverless functions and into a React application, you can check out that course. If you sign up here, you'll get a 50% off coupon on launch day, just if you want to know more about Airtable. All right, so back to airtable.com. Obviously, you'll have to create a free account, no credit card or anything like that required. And I can say that I've used this on a couple of different demo projects as well as that course, and Airtable's been really, really nice to use, and it's basically one of the easiest ways to get up and going with a database of some sort. And I can't recommend it enough to give it a shot, especially for like a sample or a demo application. It's really quick and easy to get up, and then you can scale from there as well. So let's just go ahead and create a base, and I'll click add a base here, and that's what your databases are called. And then let's start with a template. Let's just pull in one of their templates here, and let's just say project tracker. It could be anything. So let's go ahead and use this template. This should go ahead and create the base for us. And then we can see in here, we've got lots of different pieces of information, and you can see really how powerful all of this becomes, because you get a visual dashboard. Now, this is something you won't get with a traditional database. Here, you get to visually see your data, and you can have some different organizations here of a dashboard of breaking down, in this case, projects per person, project timelines, and things like that. So this is really, really cool. You see in here, we've got 16 different records, and these have different properties, columns and rows, as you'd expect in a database. But this really has the feel of like an Excel sheet. So if you've ever worked with Excel, Microsoft Excel, or Google Sheets or something like that, this looks pretty familiar, where you have the name of your columns up here, and then you have your actual rows of data, and then they fill in each of the different properties. So you see we've got a name, basically the name of the project, then a category. And in this case, if we look at the category here, it's a dropdown, right? So we can choose between different categories and change these. We can obviously do these programmatically, but then also inside of here in the GUI, we can see that done as well. And then you see a complete. So here's whether or not that project is complete. Some images if you needed to store those. And this is an array of images, so you can store more than one in here. And then who the client is. And then if we keep scrolling, we'll get even more information. So we'll see who the project lead is, the project team, the kickoff date, the due date. So you can see you can store some really powerful data in here. And what I want to do is, with this data in place, let's come over to airtable.com/API and then scroll down, and I'll need to refresh since I just created that base. And I see my project tracker here. So I'm going to select my project tracker. And then they break down the documentation into two categories over here. So the cURL and the JavaScript. So cURL is basically just going to be your raw HTTP request. That's what we're going to start with, of just making those requests inside of Postman, for example. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to allow you to see my API key because I'm going to get rid of that thing later on. And then inside of here under project tracker, you can see that it's got an ID for that base, for that specific database, this ID here, which is not necessarily secret, but it's what uniquely identifies that database, or that base as they call it in Airtable. So you can scroll down, you see some things about rate limits, and this is limited to 5 requests per second per base. If you exceed this rate, you'll receive a 429 status code and need to wait 30 seconds. So this does have some limitations, but for demos especially, this is one of the quickest and easiest ways to get started. So the way this works for authentication is you pass your API key here. So it's showing my API key. You pass that in as a bearer access token. So this is a unique key that only you should see. You shouldn't share this with any of your friends or anything like that. And when you send this along inside of an authorization header prefixed by bearer, this is going to validate basically your request coming into Airtable. Alternatively, you can also include this as a query parameter. So if you're making a GET request, for example, you can put that right there in the string. Now, again, I don't recommend storing these inside of any of your source code or sharing these with friends. This API key is something that does need to stay private to you. All right. And then let me scroll down to fields. We'll look more at that in a second. And then let's come down to the list records. And so you can see here's an example of a GET request to list out all the records. So I'm going to copy that whole thing and I'm going to scroll over to Postman. This is what I use for testing HTTP requests. A lot of people are using Insomnia now, so you can check out Insomnia. I still use Postman mainly just because that's what I'm used to. But you can see in here that we make a call to API.Airtable, and then it's suffixed with v0, so version 0. And then we have our base ID, so app, and then this whole string. So that's uniquely identifying that base. And then inside of here, we pass what basically the sheet we're looking at inside of that base is, which in this case is design projects. So let's look back at our Airtable base and notice that this up here has a name of design project. So that's the name of the tab basically that we're trying to query from. And we didn't even cover these other tasks or these other tabs of tasks and clients, but projects is probably enough here. So what this is saying is we want to pull a max number of records of 3 from design projects. And then we've got a view in here of all 20 projects. And what view is, if you come back over to the documentation, this is the name or ID of a view in the design projects table. So if this is set, only the records in that view will be returned. So you can have different views for your data and only the ones that are inside of that view will be returned. For now, I'm just going to get rid of this. So let's just stick with the max records of 3. And if I try to make this request to start off, this is going to fail because it says authentication required. And if you remember, we need to pass inside of our headers, we need to pass an authorization header. So authorization, and then this will be bearer and then space and then the token, so the API key. So let's scroll back up to see what that looks like. It's this thing right here. So let's copy that. Let's paste it in here and let's try ascend now. And now we get back data. So what comes back is an object that then has a property of records, which is an array of all of our records. So you see this is an array of records and this is an entire record here. And it's got some interesting pieces of information. One is a unique identifier that Airtable provides. Then it's got a section called fields, and then it has created time down here. So ID and created time are created by default in Airtable. And then all of the fields that we define, so if we come back to our table, all of the fields listed up here that we have the ability to define are included in this fields tab, or this fields section. This fields property has all the different objects and properties that we care about that data, which is pretty cool. And just so we're clear on this, these pieces of data obviously are very customizable. Where complete here is a checkbox. So you've got things like single line of text for a string, long text. You can think of that like a multi-line piece of text, an attachment of some sort, multiple select, single select, collaborator date, phone number, email. There's so many different pieces of data in here that you can choose from. You can really use this like any full-fledged database that you're used to. So we've done a GET. That's how you can retrieve a list of records. All right, and then we can get into the case of retrieving a specific record. So in this case, we might grab, let's grab this ID. So I'm just grabbing a specific ID. And then we can just put this on the end of the design project. So let's do design project. So from that page or that tab, we want to pull this specific record. Well, now this will pull that specific record. So this has lots of information in it, mainly just because there's different images. So these are all the images that are here. And they do some resizing where you have small, large, full, that kind of stuff. But this is all the information about that one record. So you have the ability to query a list. We actually passed in some query parameters of a max. And then we have the ability here to query a specific ID. All right, so pretty cool. Then you have the ability to create records. And in this case, let's just take this example here as well. What you do is in the body of your post, so this will be a post request now, you'll pass in an object that has a property of records, and then you'll pass in an actual record. And I think this may be an existing record. So let's do this. Let's grab just maybe that amount of information, and let's come over to our body, and let's do raw and JSON. We can get that here. And let's paste this in, and then we'll need to close out the fields and the object itself, and then the array for records, and then the closing bracket for the overall object. So we should have an array, which ends down here. We have an object inside of it, and then we have fields is its own object, and then client is an array of strings. And I think, oh, we don't need this last comma here. There we go. So that should be good. And this will turn into a post request. Authorization will still stay the same inside of the header. And then in the body, we've created just a little bit of the information, not a whole lot. And this is just a post request to that tab again, the data projects or the design projects. And let's do ascend. And now we should see that this comes back with a record that has an ID and a created time stamp. So this means that Airtable was successfully able to create that record. And if we come over into our GUI, let's see if we can scroll down. I think it's probably the first one there. Yeah, the CMA brand identity. And you see that being here because we gave it a client ID, which pulled open the actual client itself. So there's the lack of information that's there, but it's able to create them. And then if we look at an update, for example, update takes the same kind of thing. You can update multiple records. So you pass it an object that has a property of records and then an array of the records that you want to update, still to the same endpoint. So in this case, let's grab this whole record now. Let's grab this thing and let's put this inside of records so that it includes our ID and created date time. And now let's change the name to James Test. All right, and then let's send that off. And it says invalid validation parameter, check your request data. Oh, this should be now, sorry about that. This should be a patch for an update. So now let's send a patch. Must provide an array. And it looks like we don't need to send the created time property. That's a little bit odd actually, but we can get rid of that property. And then now let's try to send. And we get this back and it looks okay. So this should have updated the name of that object to name test or James Test. Let's go back over and check on that. So James Test has been updated over here. And then we can also send a delete request. But actually before we do that, an interesting note here, patch will only update the properties that you send to be updated. So in this case, in fields, we sent the name, which updated it, and then a client ID, which actually didn't change. But had that been different, it would try to update the client ID in here as well. So with patch, it'll only update the fields that have been changed. With a put, it will do a destructive update and it will clear all unspecified cell values. So if you don't pass a value for a certain cell, it will clear all of them. I would imagine most likely what you're looking at for this is a patch to go and update specific fields, but depending on the scenario, you might need a put as well. And let's just scroll down to the delete record. And then to delete a record, we make the same call that we've been making, but then we pass on the ID of that record and then make it a delete request. So let's look at this. We can take the ID out of this example, post it up there, or paste it up there, not post it, and then call this a delete. And then the body doesn't really matter here, but we delete this and then it comes back with that ID and says deleted is true. So you could pass an array of these IDs and delete multiple at one time. If we're just passing one, we just put it right here in the URL, and then it comes back and specifies that that record has been deleted. So those are all of the CRUD operations inside of Airtable using raw just HTTP requests. In this case, they're showing curl, and then we use Postman. But there's also the Airtable library here, the package in NPM to do this with JavaScript, which makes this a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. I'm going to do inside of a blank folder here called Airtable, I'm going to do an npm init, and I'm just going to, yes, you can do a -y to accept all those defaults. And let's do an npm install of Airtable. Oh, and it looks like I'm going to have issues with my project being called Airtable, so I'll call this Airtable demo. And then now let's do npm install of Airtable and see if that works. All right, so that's installing. And then inside of those that documentation that we've been looking at, inside of here, we can switch this to JavaScript. And this will show actually using the Airtable stuff that we were doing. So let's just go really quickly back through this same thing, and let's just copy some of this code here. So I'm going to copy those first 2 lines and go ahead and copy those in. So this is my API key and then the base ID. And this gets me a reference to the base itself. And then you want the table as well. So you want to get access to the specific table or tab or sheet that you're looking at, in this case, design projects. So I will copy this as well. And I'm going to create this in a variable const table equals, and then base. And then in the base that I've already initialized up here, which tab or table or sheet am I looking at? I'm looking at the design projects table. So then inside of a query, you can just call select and then a first page. And I'll show you what that means here in a second. So under, let's create a function called get records. And this is going to be an async function. So we can use async await. And then you can call table.select. And similar to how you would in other frameworks, if you don't pass anything inside of select, it's just going to get everything. So table.select, and then you say first page. So pagination is kind of built in here where you're specifying, I just want the first page of whatever the returned value is. All right, and then I'm going to say records equals await. So we'll await for that promise to resolve, for that data to come back. And then I'll log out what those records are. And then lastly, at the bottom here, we'll call get records. All right, let's see. I'm going to start this up with NodeMon. And this is basically going to allow us to run a node file, the app.js, and then auto reload anytime that file changes. So let's run this, and it should make that call. And we get all of our data coming back. So just like we expected before. And then we could also pass in some sort of filter inside of the select. So if we wanted inside of here, they're using max records, so, and then all projects for that view. And that's what they had for the demo inside of the curl documentation as well. So as we save this is actually going and making a new request, which may be hard to see here, but that went ahead and made the new request, and it got the values, and it limited it to, if we look inside of our records, we have 1 record here after the restart, 1 record there, and then 1 more record here. And there's only 3 records. So the limit is, or the max records is working. So that's how you can put basically your query information right inside of the select. And then let's just keep scrolling down. Let's retrieve a specific record. In this case, you can call base.find and then an ID. So let's create a const get record by ID equals async. All right, and then we'll say record equals await table.find, and then pass in that ID, and let's log out that record. And now let's call get record by ID. And you'd probably want to pass this string into the function. So let's do ID here and then pass in the ID that way. And now let's see this restart. And we should see at least 1 record being coming back. So it found that record. And then now let's do a const create record. And this will take a parameter of fields. This should be an object that create record. This should be an object that has the fields that we want. So in this case, we could add the name property and have this be James test. All right. And then we will say const created record, because it will return the record that it created, and await table dot, and let's go and make sure we get this right. So create a record, we will call base, or our table, so this is a reference to our table, dot create, and then we pass it the fields that we care about. So let's say table dot create, and then pass it fields, and let's log out that created record. Hopefully the log of this one is a lot shorter, since we're not really putting much information in there. So let's save that. Let's scroll down, and then we see that we get records back, and we have a lot of other information in here as well. The things that we care about are the ID here, and then the fields that are in here as well. So we don't really care about all that stuff. One of the things that we could do is we could let's create a function for minify data. I don't know what, or minify record. Don't know exactly the best way to phrase that, but what I want to do is I want to take in the raw record, and then I want to return an object that only has two properties. So it has ID, which will be record.id, and then it has fields, which will be record.fields. And then this way, if we now call minify record with the created record, what we're doing is basically just stripping out all of this unnecessary information from our perspective. So let's save that. It'll rerun now. Now we get an object that just has ID and then the fields, which includes the name. This is something I do in all of my demos. I just strip out all that information, bring it down to just the ID and the fields, and then you could bring in like the created date and things like that. But for the most part, that's all you'll need. All right, and then let's go on to const. Let's do a update record, and you could decide whether or not you want this to be a patch or a put. I'm just going to have this be a patch by default, and we'll call this the record, because this thing is actually going to need the record itself. And let's just take a look at the update record here. We'll pass in the ID of that record, and then we'll just pass all the fields. So we will separate this out. So this will be ID and then fields, and we will say const updated record, and this is await table dot, and what did we call it? Update in here? Yeah, call it update. Update. We'll pass in the ID, and then we'll pass in fields. So we're passing in the ID so it knows which record to update, and then the field so it knows which values to update on that record. And then let's log out, console log, and then call the minify of the updated record. And as we call this, let's just pass in the ID of the thing that we just created. So let's pass in, when we call update record, we'll pass in the ID first. So there's the ID, and then here's the object with the updated stuff. And so we want to create the updated as the name, just to kind of show that this is working. Save this, and this should come back with a new record, or the same record that's been updated, same ID, and you can see that the name has now been updated. And I can show you this inside of Airtable to show that here's James Test, which is the one we created before, and then here's the updated record that we created in JavaScript inside of the npm package, or with the npm package, and then we updated that title there. So that's the update, and I'm not sure, do they clarify in here? Oh, okay, so there's update and there's replace. So replace will do the destructive update, where any field that you don't clarify will basically just get rid of that field. So you have to clarify everything you want to. If you wanted to start from scratch, you could do a replace. Otherwise, you do an update, and that will just update the fields that you send. And then lastly, we'll show that you can call a destroy in here, and you just basically paste it, tell it the ID of the item, the record that you want to destroy. So in this case, we can call destroy, or I like delete. So let's say delete record, and we don't need this object in here, so we can get rid of that. We're just passing the ID. And then we want to call delete record equals async, and this will take in an ID, and this will get a reference to the deleted record if we call await table dot destroy. And notice I get IntelliSense here with this package, which is nice. And then just tell it which ID we want to destroy. And lastly, we will log out the minified version of this deleted record. All right, let's save that. And let's see, this comes back and says, basically the deleted record is really just the ID. And then we don't really care about the fields at this case, or in this case, because they were deleted. So let's just make sure if we come back over, we don't see that updated record over here. So that looks like it's working really well. That's exactly what we wanted. One of the things that I do want you to know is let's call destroy with an ID that doesn't exist. So let's call this ABs or whatever, just some random letters. This should run and this should fail. And this is going to give us an error saying that we have an unhandled exception. And that's because we're using async await, but we're not surrounding it with a try catch. So this is what you'll want to do in all of these calls is surround this with a try catch. This is if you're using async await. If you're using promises and using .then and .catch, you can obviously handle your errors that way. But in this case, I'm just going to log console error, going to error out that error that comes back. So let's run this one more time. And now this should say, give us the Airtable error, which is pretty specific. That record was not found, couldn't find what we were looking for. And then even if I change the ID back to the previous one, that thing is gone anyway. So all in all, what I'm saying is all of these asynchronous requests to the API, they can fail. And this is true for any API that you work with. So you'll want to make sure that you properly handle any errors that come back from those. So just make sure that you're doing that. All right, I think Airtable is really amazing. This is like one of the easiest and quickest ways to add some data to your application that's persistent. You don't have to create an entire database. You don't have to manage a database. Just go to Airtable, create a base, create some fields, add some data to it, and then start to work with it in the Airtable API using raw HTTP requests or the Airtable package on NPM. So I'm curious, question of the day, are you using, what are you using for any of your backend data? Are you using something like Firebase or MongoDB, or are you using Airtable? What's your preferred way to store data? And if it is something other than Airtable for a demo, what do you think of Airtable? Let me know in the comments below. And in the meantime, as I mentioned, if you enjoyed this using of Airtable to store information and doing basic CRUD operations, we will cover all of that inside of the React and Serverless Full Stack development class. And in addition to like React and security, authorization, authentication, we will cover serverless functions. We'll talk about continuous integration and deployment in Netlify, all those things, which will be a lot of fun. So if you enjoyed this, go and sign up for that as well to come out at the end of May. And at the end of the day, thanks for checking out the video. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.